She was just a quiet night shift nurse with a strange habit of talking to unconscious patients in a language nobody at Brightwater General could place. The surgeons mocked her for it behind her back, calling her accent unprofessional, until an army colonel walked into that trauma bay, heard 3 words come out of her mouth, and went pale enough to grab the wall for balance. Dana Whitfield had worked nights at Brightwater General for 2 years, and in that time, nobody had ever heard her raise her voice. She was good at her job, fast, precise, unbothered by blood or chaos, but there was something about her that never quite fit the room. A faint, unplaceable cadence under her English. A habit of murmuring to patients in words that weren't English at all. Low and rhythmic. When their vitals were crashing and there wasn't time for anything else. Most of the staff assumed it was some kind of comfort ritual. Meaningless sounds meant to soothe. Nobody asked what the words actually meant. She kept her hair pulled back in a tight, practical braid, wore her scrub sleeves rolled down even in the height of summer, and ate lunch alone in her car regardless of the weather. The other nurses had long since stopped inviting her to anything. Her charting was flawless. Her med calculations never needed double-checking. Patients who came in terrified sometimes left thanking her by name, though she never gave them more of herself than the shift required. It was, in its own way, a kind of armor, competence loud enough that nobody had to ask what was underneath it. Dr. Preston Hale asked, once, in front of a packed trauma bay, not because he cared, but because it gave him something to laugh about. "What is that? Some kind of prayer?" he said, watching her murmur over a gunshot patient while she packed a wound. "Sounds like you learned English from a fortune cookie." Whitfield. The room laughed. Dana didn't look up. She finished the pressure dressing, called out the vitals in flawless UNACCENTED English, and moved to the next task like he hadn't spoken at all. That was the pattern. Hale mocked. Dana worked. The silence that followed her out of every confrontation only seemed to make him need to win the next one more. Preston Hale was 36, the youngest attending in the department, and had never once been told no in a way that stuck. Dana's flat, unimpressed calm irritated him on a level he couldn't fully name, because it was the one thing in his professional life he couldn't bully or outtrank his way past. Marla Crawford, the charge nurse, was the one who turned it into something worse. She'd heard Dana on the phone once, in the break room, speaking rapid, fluent something into her cell before catching herself and switching back to English mid-sentence. You'd think after 2 years she'd have dropped the accent, Marla said to anyone who'd listen. Makes you wonder what she's actually hiding. Nobody asked Dana directly. It was easier to whisper. The first real crisis came on a Thursday in March. A multi-car pileup on the interstate that filled the trauma bay with 4 critical patients inside 11 minutes. The ambulance bay doors kept swinging open on a loop, gurneys wheeling through faster than the staff could clear the last one. Radios overlapping with paramedics shouting numbers nobody had time to fully process. Dana was assigned to the worst of them, a construction worker with a crushed pelvis, blood pressure crashing, consciousness fading in and out. Hale was running the code, hands slick, voice climbing toward panic as the numbers on the monitor kept dropping. 2 beds over. A second team worked a woman with a head laceration, and the whole bay had the layered, overlapping chaos of a night stretched past what the staff on shift could comfortably absorb. Alarms overlapping alarms. 3 different voices calling for supplies at once. He's slipping, clamp, now, Hale barked. Dana had the bleeding controlled before he finished the sentence. Both hands buried in the wound with a precision that came from someplace far older than nursing school. The patient started thrashing, delirious with pain and blood loss, fighting the restraints hard enough to threaten the line Dana had just secured. Without thinking, Dana leaned close to his ear and said something low and clipped, not English, not comfort babble, but short, commanding syllables that landed like an order. The man went still, not sedated, obedient. Hale stared at her for a long second, more unsettled than impressed. "What did you just say to him?" "Told him to hold still," Dana said. "It worked." "In what language? Does it matter?" "He's stable." Hale didn't answer that. He finished the procedure in silence. But something in his expression had curdled from mockery into suspicion, the discomfort of a man who'd just watched competence he couldn't explain. By the time the last of the 4 patients was stabilized, it was well past 2 in the morning. That night, in the break room, Marla brought it up again. "You calmed him down by talking gibberish at him. That's not exactly standard protocol." "Dana, it worked," Dana said, and left it there. Marla mentioned it to 2 other nurses before the week was out, and by the time it had made its second lap around the floor, the story had drifted from a strange but effective technique into something that sounded almost sinister. What followed wasn't one confrontation. It was 3 weeks of small ones, stacked on top of each other. Hale started correcting her pronunciation in front of patients, loudly, as though her accent were a medical error that needed charting. "It's discharge, not discharge," he told her once, in front of an elderly patient who looked more embarrassed than Dana did. Marla filed an informal complaint with Auer, calling Dana's unintelligible mumbling a patient safety concern, and made sure the whole floor knew she'd done it before Dana even got the meeting request on her calendar. A junior nurse left a pamphlet for an accent reduction course taped to Dana's locker, unsigned, though everyone knew exactly whose idea it was. Someone printed a satirical translation guide and left it in the break room, a mocking list of phrases attributed to Dana that nobody had actually heard her say. At the monthly staff meeting, Hale made a point of asking Dana to repeat a patient handoff report twice for clarity in front of the entire department, though nobody else in the room had asked for it repeated. A few nurses laughed along. Not out of cruelty exactly, but out of the reflex of people who'd rather join a joke than risk becoming its next target. Dana never explained herself. She never raised her voice, never cried in the supply closet the way some of the newer nurses did after a bad shift with Hale. She simply did her job, cleaned up, and went home to an apartment with a single framed photograph turned face down in a drawer she never opened during daylight hours. The written warning came on a Tuesday. Dr. Ellen Voss, the director of nursing, slid it across her desk without much ceremony. "You're an excellent nurse, Dana," she said, "but patients have complained they can't understand you under stress. Consider it a formal note in your file." "Has a patient ever actually complained?" Dana asked. "Or has Dr. Hale?" Dr. Voss didn't answer that directly, which was its own kind of answer. Dana signed the warning without argument, and went back to her floor, because there wasn't a version of this fight she could win by explaining. 3 days passed without incident. The kind of calm that settles over a department after a storm nobody quite named out loud. Hale kept his distance. More from strategy than remorse, Dr. Voss's written warning had given him exactly the outcome he wanted, and there was nothing left to gain from pushing further. Dana worked her shifts the same way she always had. She didn't seek anyone out for sympathy, didn't linger in the break room long enough to invite conversation, didn't give the rumor mill anything fresh to chew on. If anything, the quiet felt like a held breath, the kind that comes right before something breaks it. On Friday afternoon, before her shift started, Dana sat in her car in the hospital parking lot for 11 minutes without turning the engine off, watching rain streak the windshield, doing nothing at all. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was closer to someone bracing for weather they couldn't see yet but had learned, a long time ago, to sense coming anyway. She clocked in at 7 p.m. sharp. Same as always. And by 11:40 that night, the radio was already crackling with the first reports from Route 9. The call came in at 11:40 p.m. on a Friday. A multi-vehicle collision on Route 9 involving a military convoy returning from a training exercise. 6 soldiers inbound. 2 critical. 1 with a crushed chest and a collapsing lung. The night had already been a full one before the call came in. A cardiac arrest in Bay 2. A pediatric asthma attack that had the whole floor holding its breath for 4 minutes. And the staff coming off that adrenaline barely had time to reset before the ambulance bay doors blew open again. The became a different kind of chaos the second the doors opened, uniforms soaked in blood. Radios crackling with call signs instead of addresses. A wounded sergeant thrashing on the gurney hard enough that it took 2 orderlies to hold him down. The other 5 soldiers, walking wounded and minor fractures, filled the hallway with a tense, watchful quiet, the discipline of men trained to stay out of the way of people trying to save one of their own. Hale was assigned to the worst of them. Dana was his nurse. She'd clocked the sergeant's condition the second the gurney cleared the doors, the specific gray tint under his skin, the shallow, uneven rise of his chest, and had the trauma bay prepped and waiting before Hale had even finished reading the paramedic's handoff report. Tension pneumothorax. Right side, I need to decompress now, Hale said, scalpel shaking in his hand as the soldier convulsed against the restraints. Disoriented. Screaming something that wasn't quite words. Hale hesitated. The needle hovered. His hands weren't finding the landmark. And every second of hesitation was a second the man's oxygen numbers dropped further. The monitor's alarm climbed into a higher, more insistent pitch. And for a moment the entire trauma bay seemed to be holding its breath around one trembling scalpel. Doctor. His heart rate is crashing, you have to go now. Dana said, sharp and flat. I can't get a clean angle with him fighting me like this. Just hold him down. The soldier's thrashing had nothing to do with pain anymore. It was the panic of a man locked somewhere else entirely, a memory. A flashback. A place this hospital couldn't reach him in English. His eyes were open but unseeing. Fixed on something none of them could see. His mouth forming fragments of words in a language none of the staff around him recognized. Dana recognized it immediately. She didn't ask permission. She leaned over the gurney, put her hand flat against the man's chest, and spoke directly into his ear, low, fast, in the same clipped, foreign rhythm she'd used weeks earlier. Except this time 3 specific words landed different than anything she'd said before. The soldier's eyes snapped open. The panic broke. For one suspended second, his whole body went still, staring at her like he was trying to place a ghost. For that 1 second, the trauma bay around them seemed to fall away entirely, Hale's shaking hands, the alarm's insistent pitch. The orderlies still braced for the man to start thrashing again. It was just her voice, and whatever door those 3 words had opened in him. There, Dana said to Hale, calm and immediate. He'll hold still now. Go. Hale, stunned into motion, finished the procedure. The needle found its mark. A hiss of trapped air escaped, and the collapsed lung reinflated as the monitor's alarm finally began to settle. And in the sudden quiet that followed, the soldier was still staring at Dana, lips moving, trying to ask her something his throat wasn't ready to manage yet. Across the trauma bay, a second team was working on the sergeant with the shrapnel wound to his shoulder. And even amid their own controlled chaos, 2 of the paramedics who'd ridden in with the convoy exchanged a look. They'd both clearly clocked what Dana had just done. And neither one of them looked at her the way Hale had been looking at her for the last 3 weeks. The confrontation happened in the hallway, 20 minutes later. In front of half the department. Hale rounded on Dana the second the soldier was wheeled off to surgery. Humiliation curdling into fury now that the adrenaline had drained out of the room. Word of what had happened in the trauma bay had already started spreading down the hall. And Hale seemed to sense he was losing whatever authority he'd had left over the story. Nurses who'd normally have kept walking were slowing down near the nurses' station, drawn by the electricity of a confrontation about to happen in public. You shoved past a licensed physician mid-procedure. You put your hands on a patient without authorization. I stabilized him so you could finish. Dana said, you think because you got lucky with some parlor trick, you get to run this? Hale's voice climbed, drawing eyes from every direction. That's not medicine. It's a liability. I'm reporting this to the board. He grabbed her wrist, hard enough to make his point, and yanked her sleeve up to make a show of it in front of the gathering crowd, as if exposing her arm would expose whatever he thought she was hiding. There was nothing to see. No tattoo, no scar. Just skin. And the faint, old tan line of a watch she hadn't worn in years. "Look at her," Hale said anyway, playing to the hallway now. Mumbling in tongues over a dying man. Marla, watching from the nurse's station, made no move to intervene. Dr. Voss had come as far as the corner of the hallway and stopped there, clipboard in hand, unsure whether this was a moment to step into or simply watch unfold. "Is there a problem here?" The voice didn't shout. It didn't need to. It came from the double doors, low and even, and every conversation in that hallway stopped at once. The man in the doorway wore the dress uniform of the United States Army. Silver eagles on his shoulders. A chest full of ribbons under a name tape that read Ridgway. He'd come the moment he heard his men were in a crash, driving faster than the speed limit allowed the entire way from base. And he'd arrived in time to hear exactly enough of Hale's tirade to understand the shape of it. The hallway seemed to physically rearrange itself around him. Nurses straightening, and orderlies stepping back to clear the path. The walking wounded soldiers along the wall coming half upright out of pure reflex despite their injuries. Hale straightened, instinctively performing for rank. "Colonel, just addressing a serious lapse in professional conduct. Your soldier is stable, but this nurse." Colonel Thomas Ridgway wasn't looking at Hale. His eyes had gone past him entirely, locked on Dana's face with an expression that had nothing to do with the hallway they were standing in. It was the specific look of a man doing rapid, disbelieving math, comparing a face in front of him against a memory he'd long since filed under closed, unresolved, gone. "Say that again," he said quietly. Not to Hale, to Dana. "Say what, sir, what you said to him. In the trauma bay." His voice had dropped, the parade ground authority draining out of it. "Say it again." Dana hesitated. She could feel every eye in the hallway on her now, Hale's, Marla's, the soldiers propped up on their gurneys. Dr. Voss frozen near the corner. Then, quiet enough that only the people closest could hear it, she repeated the 3 words. Colonel Ridgway's hand found the wall behind him. He looked, for a moment, like a much younger man. Like whatever version of him had stood in that riverbed 12 years ago had briefly stepped forward through the decorated colonel standing in this hallway now. "Hollis," he said. The hallway went dead silent. Hale's mouth was still open from whatever sentence he'd been building toward, now completely abandoned. "That was my call sign," Dana said, "a long time ago." Colonel Ridgway didn't explain himself quickly. He told it the way men tell things they've kept locked down for a long time, in full, because the moment finally demanded it. 12 years ago, Dana hadn't been Dana Whitfield. She'd been an army linguist attached to a special operations team in a valley where half the interpreters sent before her hadn't lasted a season. She wasn't supposed to be within a mile of the fighting, Ridgway said, his voice carrying now to the whole hallway. Her job was outreach. She was 26 years old. The ambush came at dusk, a coordinated attack that pinned the team in a dry riverbed for 6 hours. Radios jammed. Air support delayed by weather. Dana crawled through open ground to drag wounded men to cover, running combat casualty care with nothing but a med kit and a terrifying comm she'd learned to switch on when there wasn't room left for panic. The riverbed had gone from 100 degrees at noon to freezing by midnight, and Ridgway remembered, would tell her later, quietly, once the hallway had emptied out, that she'd given him her own jacket somewhere in hour 3 without seeming to notice the cold herself at all. "She kept me breathing with a collapsed airway and a chest wound for 4 hours before extraction," Ridgway said, loud enough now that the whole hallway could hear him. "I remember the sound of her voice more clearly than I remember my own name that night. She talked to me in Pashto the entire time, because English wasn't landing anymore." He looked back at Hale, and his voice went flat and cold. "You called that a liability?" Hale had nothing left to say. His face had gone the color of the hallway floor. After the extraction, the army lost track of her. Ridgway continued. People like her sometimes changed their names when they came home, because a classified record with no easy way to explain it wasn't a life most people could carry publicly. I didn't know if she was alive. I've spent 12 years not knowing. He turned back to Dana, and for a moment the decorated colonel looked less like an officer and more like a man finally putting down something heavy. You saved my life in a riverbed on the other side of the world, he said. And tonight, you saved one of my men in a hallway in Ohio. He let that sit for a moment, looking around at the hallway full of people who'd spent the last 3 weeks deciding they understood exactly who Dana Whitfield was. Behind him, one of the walking wounded soldiers, still bandaged from the crash, spoke up without quite meaning to. Sir, is this? He stopped himself, unsure if the question was his to ask. Yes, Ridgway said, not turning around. It is. Nobody needed him to finish the sentence. The language you keep slipping into under stress. Ridgway said, quieter now, just for her. That's not an accent, is it? That's the riverbed. Some things stay louder than English when it matters. Dana said, I never chose it. It just comes back when everything else goes quiet. Ridgway looked around at the hallway. None of you knew any of this, he said. Not quite a question. No, sir. Dr. Voss said quietly. We didn't. Then let me be clear about what you've had working this floor for 2 years. Ridgway said. A woman who kept me alive in the worst 6 hours of my life, and who came home to a country that couldn't figure out what box to file her in. You called her a liability for the exact thing that makes her one of the most capable people I've ever served beside. The 2 soldiers, well enough to sit up on their gurneys, bandaged and pale, raised weak salutes toward Dana without being told to. A third, still catching his breath from surgery prep, managed a nod that cost him visible effort. Even the soldier with the crushed pelvis, groggy from sedation, turned his head toward her and mouthed something that might have been a thank you or might have simply been her name. The story of what had happened in the trauma bay had already traveled the length of the hallway twice by then. Dana didn't salute back. She wasn't active duty anymore, and she knew the difference. She placed her hand over her heart instead, and inclined her head. Colonel Ridgway stepped forward and embraced her. Thank you, he said. For then, and for tonight. Just doing my job, sir. Dana said. Marla Crawford, watching from the nurse's station, had gone pale enough to match the wall behind her, the unintelligible mumbling complaint sitting very differently in her memory now. Dr. Ellen Voss, who'd come down to check on the commotion, was already holding the written warning she'd issued 3 weeks earlier, looking at it like it had turned into something she wanted to burn. Hale didn't say another word. He stood frozen in the middle of the hallway for a long moment after Ridgway finished speaking. Every correction, every joke, every complaint he'd filed or encouraged, now measured against a riverbed and a man's life he'd never known existed. He walked into the locker room, changed out of his scrubs without a word to anyone, and put in his resignation the next morning. Marla requested a transfer to a different floor within the week, unable to hold eye contact with Dana in the break room anymore. She left the accent reduction pamphlets memory and spoken between them, though everyone on the floor understood exactly what it meant when she cleared out her locker early on a Tuesday. Dr. Voss tore up the written warning that same night, and told Dana, quietly, the following week that the file would reflect nothing but 2 years of exceptional work, because that was the truth. And it had simply taken a hallway full of witnesses and a colonel's testimony for the hospital to see it. She also, without being asked, pulled the satirical translation guide off the break room bulletin board herself and put a stop to 2 other small cruelties nobody had bothered reporting before that night. Dana didn't ask for an apology from any of them. She didn't need one. She went back to the nurse's station, picked up her tablet, and asked who her next patient was, because the extraordinary night was over, and the ordinary ones were still waiting, the same as they always had been. The soldier from the trauma bay caught her an hour later, Before his transfer upstairs, still weak but lucid now. "Those words you said," he said. "What do they mean?" "Not important," Dana said. "What matters is you're still here to ask." He didn't push. Something in the way she said it told him that was the only answer he was going to get, and it was enough. Two of the other soldiers stopped by her station before they were discharged. Quiet. A little awkward. One of them simply saying, "Thank you, ma'am," before walking off. Unsure what else there was to add to that. That night, when her shift finally ended, Dana went home to the same bare apartment, the same quiet rooms. But for the first time in longer than she could easily count, she walked straight to the drawer she never opened during daylight hours. And opened it anyway, in the gray early light of a Saturday morning. The photograph inside was worn soft at the corners, 5 people in desert fatigues. Arms slung around each other's shoulders, squinting against a sun that had nothing to do with Ohio. She recognized Ridgway immediately, 12 years younger, grinning in a way she hadn't seen on his face in the hallway tonight. She recognized the others too, each face a name she still knew by heart, some of whom she'd carried across open ground under fire, one of whom she hadn't been fast enough to save. She didn't cry. She wasn't built that way anymore. But she set the photograph upright on her windowsill instead of face down in the drawer, and let it stay there, in daylight, for the first time in 4 years. Outside, the storm that had brought the convoy in had finally passed. And gray morning light was starting to find its way through the blinds, the kind of ordinary daybreak that comes after a night that was anything but. Dana stood at the window a while longer than she meant to, coffee going cold in her hands, before finally getting ready for the shift she'd be back on again by evening. Have you ever judged someone before learning what they'd survived? Tell me in the comments.